A German Shepherd lay on the edge of life inside the Montana sanctuary. Ribs protruding coat-patchy breaths, barely more than whispers. Today was meant to be his final injection. Then a voice cut through the hum of machines. "Stay strong, Marine." Brindle's ear twitched. The monitor flickered upward. Hope returned to the room. What followed would uncover a silent poisoning, awaken a bond forged in the crucible of war, and prove that one life could pull another back from the brink. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments, and if you believe no animal or veteran should ever be left behind, hit subscribe. This story might just restore your faith in second chances. Morning came gray and heavy over the quiet town of Redwood Ridge, Montana, where late autumn winds swept through towering pines, carrying the scent of damp earth. The sanctuary perched at the city's edge, a modest patch carved from the wilderness, humble yet vital, where injured animals were brought to heal or to find their final dignity. Clouds sagged low, as if the mountains themselves leaned closer, watching what would unfold on this solemn day. Inside the modest veterinary wing of the Redwood Ridge Animal Sanctuary, Doc Gideon Holloway moved with slightly hunched shoulders, a clipboard pressed tightly to his chest, as though the papers it held could shield him from what he knew he must do. At 38, Gideon was of average height, lean from long days on his feet. His chestnut hair, usually tied back in a no-nonsense ponytail, had escaped in loose strands across his weary face. His brown eyes held kindness, yet the weight of countless sleepless nights worrying over creatures who could not speak rested heavily there. Compassion was his armor, but it often left him wounded. He had chosen this path after losing his younger brother in a car accident a decade ago. He could not save him, but he had vowed to save every life within reach. That vow made mornings like this unbearable. His destination was the isolation ward, where a German Shepherd named Brindle lay curled on a straw blanket. Brindle had once been magnificent, 5 years old, broad-shouldered with a strong black and tan coat and amber eyes sharp with intelligence. But weeks of illness had reduced him to a shadow of himself. His ribs pressed against thinning fur patches of hair missing his once commanding presence, dwindled to shallow breaths and the faintest twitch of an ear. Brindle had been found abandoned near a roadside ditch, collapsed from exhaustion, barely able to lift his head. For 3 weeks, Gideon and his staff had fought to save him blood tests, 4 drips, antibiotics, specialized diets. Nothing worked. Brindle no longer ate, barely drank, and his eyes had grown dull. Today, Gideon knew would have to be his last day. The sanctuary's hallways echoed with muted footsteps as volunteers moved through morning duties, faces subdued. Among them was Daisy Pike, tall and willowy in her 40s, with soft blonde hair streaked with gray. Daisy had joined the sanctuary after losing her husband to cancer, finding in caring for animals a way to heal her grief. She moved quietly, spoke to animals in soothing tones, but avoided long conversations with people. Her sorrow often made her seem distant. She carried food bowls down the hall, eyes meeting Gideon's briefly, both exchanging a silent acknowledgement. Today would not be easy. Gideon reached the isolation room and paused, pressing his forehead to the cool glass of the door. Inside, Brindle lay curled, breathing, slow chest, rising and falling like the distant rhythm of a drum. He opened the door gently, the faint creak echoing. "I'm so sorry, big guy," he whispered, kneeling beside him. Hands checking the pulse stethoscope, confirming what he already knew. Brindle's heart was weak body shutting down. The shepherd's amber eyes fluttered half open, landing on him with a faint recognition, a silent plea. Gideon's throat tightened. He had administered euthanasia countless times, telling himself it was mercy. But Brindle's unwavering gaze pierced him with guilt, as though asking for one more chance. Laughter and low male voices drifted from the sanctuary entrance. A group of visiting veterans had arrived, part of a monthly outreach program. Among them was Colt Remington, rolling himself down the corridor in a well-worn wheelchair. 37 tall, even-seated broad shoulders, hinting at the strength he once held during his years as a Marine. Dark hair cropped short, flecked with gray at the temples. A strong jaw shadowed by stubble. Gray-blue eyes, both piercing and distant, the eyes of a man who had seen too much. Colt had been injured by an IED in Afghanistan, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. His return home was marked by long nights of anger, despair, and restless guilt for surviving when others hadn't. The sanctuary had become his refuge, where the quiet of animals was kinder than the emptiness of rooms. He wheeled himself slowly down the hall, nodding at Gideon, who managed a faint smile. "Morning, Doc," he said, voice calm but gravelly with fatigue. Gideon nodded back, grateful for his presence, yet pained that he was about to witness what he had dreaded. Behind him trailed Amos Thatcher, a broad-shouldered, easygoing veteran with a booming laugh, and Rufus Lane, a wiry man in his 50s who rarely spoke, but always offered a steady hand when needed. They were companions in Colt Remington's new life, bound by shared history and the unspoken understanding of men who had been to war. When Colt reached the doorway of the isolation room, his eyes fell on Brindle. For a moment, everything else in the sanctuary vanished. He saw not just a sick dog, but a fighter, lying in silence, worn down yet unbowed. Brindle's amber eyes lifted weakly, meeting Colt's gray-blue gaze, and something sparked between them, recognition, or perhaps kinship. Colt's hand resting on the wheel of his chair tightened. He knew that look. He had seen it in the mirror during his first month home, when he could not walk, the weight of survival pressing down on his chest like a stone. It was the look of someone refusing to quit, even as their body betrayed them. Doc Gideon Holloway cleared his throat, drawing Colt back. "We've tried everything," he said, softly kneeling beside Brindle. "It's been 3 weeks. He's only getting worse. Today was supposed to be—" His voice cracked, the rest unspoken. Colt nodded slowly, lips pressed tight. He glanced once more at Brindle, who gave the faintest flick of his tail. Colt exhaled, and for the first time in months, words came unbidden. "Stay strong, Marine," he muttered under his breath. It was a phrase he had repeated countless times to brothers in arms on the battlefield, a call to endure, to hold the line, to believe. Doc Gideon Holloway looked up sharply. Brindle shifted ever so slightly, his ears twitching, as though the words had pierced the fog of illness. The dog's chest rose with a deeper breath, his head turning the slightest fraction toward Colt's voice. Gideon's eyes widened, disbelief mingling with hope. Colt blinked, unsure if he had imagined it, but Rufus and Amos, standing behind him, had seen it too. Daisy Pike, carrying a tray in the hall, paused and gasped softly. Brindle had not moved in days until now. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the dog's ragged breathing and the hum of medical equipment. Gideon steadied his hands, checked the monitor, and saw the faint spike in Brindle's heart rate. His throat tightened again, but this time not with grief. Maybe he whispered half to himself. He stood turning to the veterans. "I need to postpone the procedure just for a few hours. Something's happening here and I can't ignore it." Colt looked back at Brindle, the faintest flicker of life still burning in the dog's amber eyes. For the first time in weeks, The sanctuary carried not only the weight of sorrow, but also the fragile, trembling breath of hope. Morning inside Redwood Ridge. Animal Sanctuary had shifted from routine to uncanny in a matter of minutes. The quiet resignation that had hung over the building like fog now gave way to whispers, startled looks, and cautious anticipation. Brindle the German Shepherd, once destined for his last injection, had stirred at the sound of Colt's voice. His frail body had found the strength to move in a way none of the staff had seen for weeks. The beeping of the monitor, once steady in its decline, now showed a slight uptick. A fragile but unmistakable sign of life, refusing to let go. Doc Gideon Holloway, still crouched beside Brindle, adjusted the monitor's sensors to confirm what his eyes had already told him. His brown eyes, dulled by grief that morning, brightened with incredulity. A man who had trained himself to keep emotions separate from judgment now felt his pulse racing. He had buried hope many times before, but Brindle's faint movement stirred something reckless in him, the possibility of a miracle. Practical and cautious, yet there was a line in Gideon's chest where compassion often overruled protocol. Today, that line had been crossed. Behind him, Colt shifted uneasily in his wheelchair. His broad shoulders tensed as he realized everyone's eyes were on him, as though he had conjured life itself with a single phrase. His gray-blue eyes flickered with both embarrassment and the weight of memory. He had said, "Stay strong, Marine," 1,000 times in dusty desert air to comrades bleeding out to brothers who never made it home. To hear the same words stir a dying dog left him unsettled. Colt was not a man eager for attention. He preferred the corners of the sanctuary, the quiet of animal pens, the silent company of creatures who asked nothing of him. Yet here he was, the unwilling center of something extraordinary. Among the witnesses stood Rufus Lane, the wiry, weathered veteran in his 50s, whose silence had long been his defining trait. His dark eyes narrowed as he leaned on the doorframe, lips pressed tight, as though measuring the moment against a soldier's instinct. He did not speak, but the furrow of his brow betrayed thoughtfulness, almost suspicion. Beside him, Amos Thatcher, heavy-set, round-faced, with salt-and-pepper hair, let out a low whistle. Amos was the kind of man whose laughter usually filled the sanctuary, masking his own battle with loneliness since retiring from the Marines. But in this moment, even he could only manage a hushed, "Would you look at that?" Further down the hall, Daisy Pike, the tall, willowy volunteer with grief etched in her bones, clutched her tray of food bowls to her chest. Her pale blue eyes widened as Brindle's ears twitched. Daisy Pike, still tender from the loss of her husband, carried her sorrow like a second skin, yet she softened around the animals. Life had taught her that grief could carve silence into a person, but compassion could still pour out in unexpected ways. Now she whispered softly, almost to herself, "He heard you." Doc Gideon Holloway's clinical mind snapped back to urgency. "We're postponing," he said firmly, rising to his feet. His voice carried authority tinged with trembling hope. "No euthanasia today. Not until we understand what's happening." He snapped his fingers at a young assistant standing nearby, Jed Raleigh, a new employee at the sanctuary. Jed was in his late 20s, sandy blonde hair tucked under a cap, tall, athletic, the sort who looked at home outdoors. He had joined the sanctuary only 3 months prior, polite and competent, though perhaps a little too eager to avoid extra work. To Gideon, he was a useful but untested member of the team. Jed called the lab. "Tell them we need expanded panels, heavy metals, toxins, anything outside the normal range. Rush it, no delays." Jed nodded quickly, though his blue eyes flickered with something unreadable before disappearing down the corridor. Gideon turned back to Brindle, brushing a hand gently over the matted coat. "We're not done yet, boy," he whispered. The German shepherd's amber eyes, though half-lidded, followed his voice with faint recognition. His once powerful chest lifted with another labored breath, as though attempting to obey a command he could not fully comprehend. The room settled into a strange stillness. For long moments only the soft hiss of oxygen, the faint hum of equipment, and the shallow rhythm of Brindle's breathing filled the silence. Finally, Colt Remington broke it. "Maybe it's just reflex," he said, voice low, trying to convince himself as much as the others. He looked away uneasy under the weight of the moment, but Gideon shook his head. "Reflex doesn't raise a heart rate like this," he countered, tapping the monitor. Reflex doesn't turn the head toward a specific voice. His tone was measured but insistent, the tone of someone who had seen the inexplicable before and knew not to ignore it. Amos Thatcher stepped forward, folding his arms across his broad chest. "Well, Doc, if you're asking me, looks like the old boy just remembered what it means to fight." He grinned faintly, though his eyes glistened with the memory of men who hadn't had a chance to fight any longer. Rufus Lane said nothing, but his silence carried the weight of agreement. Daisy set her tray down carefully and leaned closer to the glass hands pressed against it. "Maybe he's remembering," she murmured, voice like a thread pulled from grief. "Animals remember love too. Maybe he remembers what it feels like not to be alone." Gideon exhaled, mind already racing. He scribbled quick notes on his clipboard, the pen scratching across the page like a lifeline. If he can respond, then there's something in there worth saving. "I want to know why. No assumptions. We'll keep him comfortable, run every test we can." He paused, looking directly at Colt. "And if you're willing, I'd like you to stay. Whatever's happening between you two, it might be important." Colt shifted uneasily in his chair. He was not a man used to being relied upon. The Marines had taught him discipline and sacrifice, but his injury had left him believing his usefulness had ended. Now, with everyone watching as though he held the key to a dying dog's survival, he felt exposed. Still, he glanced back at Brindle. In the dog's weak but unwavering gaze, he saw a flicker of himself, the man who had once carried others when they could not walk. Colt nodded slowly. "I'll stay," he said simply, words heavy but certain. Gideon gave a firm nod, relief softening his features. He turned to the group, tone brisk again. "For now we monitor. No assumptions." This didn't change the fact that Brindle was critically ill, but it meant they owed him the chance to tell them more. Gideon looked at Daisy. "Could you prepare some blankets and keep the room quiet?" "He needs calm, grateful for something tangible to do." Daisy hurried off with long strides, her figure a pale shadow in the dim corridor. As the group dispersed, the sanctuary's atmosphere shifted. Where there had been despair, there was now a fragile sense of watchfulness, as though the entire building held its breath. Gideon lingered beside Brindle, scribbling notes and whispering reassurances. Colt wheeled closer to the window, hands resting on his chair's armrests. Brindle's amber eyes tracked him, following each movement with slow precision. For Colt, it felt less like coincidence and more like recognition. Hours later, the sanctuary would still buzz with speculation. Volunteers whispered about the veteran and the dying dog, seemingly bound by some invisible thread. For now, in the stillness of that room, hope, small, trembling, but undeniable, took its first breath. The next days at Redwood Ridge unfolded under a tension that was fragile and electric. Each morning the sanctuary opened its doors to a hush more reverent than usual, as if everyone from staff to volunteers sensed that something extraordinary hovered within the isolation ward where Brindle lay. The German Shepherd, still gaunt and weak, had begun responding to voices, especially one. Every time Colt Remington rolled his chair into the corridor and spoke, Brindle's ears flickered, his chest rose deeper, and his amber eyes seemed to glow against the haze of exhaustion. Doc Gideon Holloway maintained his usual clinical precision, yet the subtle change in his manner did not escape anyone. A man used to restraining emotion for professionalism, he now lingered longer beside Brindle's stethoscope, pressed to his ribs, while his pen scribbled furiously across the clipboard. His auburn hair was tied back tightly, but loose strands fell each time he bent over, and though fatigue etched lines across his face, there was a fire in his brown eyes. The rare thrill of witnessing something inexplicable stirred him. Colt, too, found himself drawn back more often than he intended. He told himself it was for Brindle's sake, because Gideon had asked him to stay, but the truth was more complicated. In Brindle's faint stirrings, he saw not just survival, but recognition, as though the dog's fight mirrored his own. One morning he wheeled closer to the glass, humming under his breath. Then the melody swelled into a few bars of a marching song Marines had sung under desert skies. Brindle's ears lifted instantly, trembling with effort, and he released a low whimper, fragile yet purposeful, silencing the corridor. The shepherd tried to push forward, paws scraping the straw ribs, straining as he dragged himself toward the glass partition. Standing nearby, Daisy Pike clasped her hands to her chest, tall and slender, tired blue eyes carrying the weight of widowhood. Her grief had shaped her gentleness into sacred patience. She whispered, "He remembers. Something. Or someone." Her voice cracked with the echo of her own loss. She had always believed animals bore memories like humans, and Brindle's stirring seemed to confirm it. Doc Gideon Holloway wrote rapidly in his notes, increased responsiveness to auditory stimuli correlation to Colt's voice, observed attempts to move toward the source. He underlined the last phrase twice, aware that such behavior could mean the difference between euthanasia and prolonging treatment. That afternoon, another figure arrived at the sanctuary summoned by Gideon for further evaluation. Eli Cormack, a veterinary neurologist in his mid-40s, carried himself with the precise efficiency of a man accustomed to crisis consultations. Tall and slightly stooped from years hunched over microscopes with thinning sandy hair and sharp hazel eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, Eli's reputation was pragmatic. No frills, little sentiment, but thorough to the bone. He greeted Gideon curtly, handshake, brisk, and set his leather case on the counter, prepared to dismantle assumptions. Unresponsive for weeks, and now showing selective reactions, he said after the briefing. We'll need to rule out neurological anomalies, trauma, toxins, residual training, cues, anything that could explain this change. His voice was calm, but skeptical, a reminder that hope is not science. When Colt sang again in Eli's presence, Brindle responded, ears lifted, head turned toward the sound, a faint growl pressing from his chest, yearning. Eli adjusted his glasses, leaning in with surprise. Interesting. That's targeted, not random reflex. Document everything. He looked directly at Colt. You'll keep doing that? Colt nodded, unease rippling through him. He had not expected to become part of a medical chart. Later that evening, as twilight painted Montana's sky in dusky purples and golds, Colt sat by Brindle's ward window, humming softly. His voice cracked with memory, and unbidden his mind drifted back to a desert patrol years ago. His unit had worked with another German Shepherd, Rex, trained to detect explosives. Rex had saved lives repeatedly, bounding ahead, with ears sharp, tail stiff, alerting men before stepping into death. He remembered the day Rex had been injured, the handlers' cries, the men rallying to carry him back under fire. He remembered crouching in the dust, stroking Rex's head, whispering the same words he now murmured. "Stay strong, Marine." His throat tightened. Perhaps it was coincidence that Brindle resembled Rex so closely. Black saddle, across the back amber eyes, loyal even in pain. Or perhaps memory was not bound to coincidence at all. Gideon observed Colt's silence, noting how Brindle, too weak to rise fully, dragged himself inch by inch closer to the partition whenever Colt sang or spoke. He caught his assistant Jed Raleigh watching with narrowed eyes, sandy hair shadowing his expression. Jed's politeness had always been slightly mechanical, and now, though he dutifully fetched supplies, Gideon noticed his gaze linger on Brindle in a way he couldn't decipher. He filed it away, though the day's discoveries pushed suspicion aside. By week's end, Brindle had shown enough consistent reactions that Gideon convened a short meeting in his cramped office. Daisy Pike stood quietly in the corner, hands folded, while Amos Thatcher leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his jovial nature subdued. Rufus Lane sat silently wiry frame, perched on the edge of a chair, eyes dark and thoughtful. Eli Cormack spread charts and EEG scans across the desk, sharp eyes behind glasses. "Whatever else you think," he said, tapping the charts, "this dog is fighting. He's responding to very specific stimuli, and that alone warranted further investigation." Gideon couldn't explain it yet, but it was real. Colt Remington shifted in his wheelchair, broad shoulders stiff. "He's not just reacting," he said slowly. "He's trying to remember that sound, that song. It means something to him." He didn't add that it also meant something to himself, though the veterans in the room seemed to understand without words. Doc Gideon Holloway closed his clipboard face firm. "Then we continue. No euthanasia, not when he's telling us he's not ready to go." He scanned the room, daring anyone to challenge him. No one did. That night, the sanctuary settled into uneasy quiet. Brindle, lying weak but determined in his straw bed, raised his head once more as Colt's voice drifted through the glass. The connection, invisible but undeniable, bound them both, soldier and shepherd, by memory and fight. For the first time in weeks, Brindle's tail gave a faint, deliberate thump against the straw, as if answering a call from long ago. The week passed under a veil of tense anticipation at Redwood Ridge Animal Sanctuary. Each day, Brindle grew slightly more alert. Amber eyes following the movement of people across the room, ears twitching at the faintest sound of Colt's gravelly voice. Yet his frailty remained obvious, gaunt, patchy fur, shallow breaths. Something deeper gnawed at his body, and Gideon knew instinct alone could not carry him. The expanded panels he had ordered days before finally arrived on a cold Thursday morning. A courier van crunched across the gravel drive, delivering a thick envelope sealed with the lab's insignia. Gideon carried it into his office, fingers trembling slightly as he tore it open. The office was small, but meticulous walls lined with books on animal physiology and framed photographs of rescued animals. He sank into his chair, hazel eyes scanning the dense charts, brow furrowed. Then his lips parted in shock. The numbers were unambiguous, elevated thallium levels far beyond environmental exposure. Thallium, an obscure and highly toxic metal rarely encountered outside deliberate poisoning. His heart sank. Brindle hadn't simply been unlucky. He had been targeted. Gideon carried the file back into the ward lab coat fluttering behind him. Colt looked up from his wheelchair, humming quietly, to Brindle gray-blue eyes catching the intensity on Gideon's face. "Doc," he asked, voice low. Gideon held the file close to his chest. "It isn't disease. It isn't age. Brindle has been poisoned deliberately." The words fell into the room like stones in a pond. Daisy Pike, standing in the corner with folded arms, gasped. Tall and slender, her pale face reflected both anger and sorrow. Grief had taught her silence, but cruelty like this ignited fire, even in the gentlest hearts. Amos Thatcher muttered a curse under his breath, heavy frame stiffening as if readying for confrontation. Rufus Lane said nothing, but his wiry figure leaned forward, eyes narrowed, jaw tight with suspicion. Gideon laid the file on the counter. Thallium is rare. It doesn't just appear. Someone gave it to him. He hesitated, scanning faces. Someone here wanted him dead. The air seemed to chill even as the heaters hummed. Colt's shoulders stiffened. He had known betrayal before, in deserts where allies became enemies, where one careless move could doom a squad. Now that same shadow hung here. His eyes flickered toward the door where a familiar figure appeared. Jed Raleigh, the young assistant, entered carrying a tray of fresh towels. Tall, sandy-haired, in his late 20s, fit and athletic. But his blue eyes darted restlessly from face to face. Since joining 3 months earlier, Jed had been helpful, but oddly detached, as though his mind was elsewhere, even while his hands were busy. He set the towels down and offered a thin smile. "Everything okay?" Brindle's response was immediate. The GermanShepherd, weak though he was, lifted his head and released a low growl rumbling deep from his chest. Ears flattened. Amber eyes locked on Jed with sudden intensity. It was the first true growl Gideon had heard from him in weeks, and it made the hairs on his neck rise. The room froze. Daisy instinctively stepped closer to the pen, eyes sharp with protective intensity. Amos straightened hands curling into fists, while Rufus's gaze settled coldly on Jed. Colt wheeled slightly forward, voice calm, but carrying the edge of command he once used in battle. "Funny," he said. "Brindle hasn't made a sound in weeks. Not until you walked in." Jed blinked, polite smile, faltering. "He's just stressed. Sick dogs act strange, defensive eyes avoiding Brindle." But the growl deepened, body trembling as Brindle pushed closer to the glass. Gideon raised a hand. "That's enough for today, Jed. You can leave the supplies. I'll handle the rest." Doc Gideon. Holloway's voice was clipped, the professional calm of a woman suppressing unease. Jed Raleigh hesitated, then nodded stiffly, backing out of the room. The door clicked shut behind him. The silence that followed was heavy. Brindle collapsed back onto his straw, exhausted from the effort, yet his eyes never left the door. Gideon exhaled, rubbing his temples. "That was no coincidence," he whispered. He turned to Colt Remington. "You saw his reaction." Colt nodded grimly. "Dogs know," he said, voice low, better than people sometimes. "If Brindle thinks someone heard him." He let the thought hang unfinished. Eli. Cormac, the neurologist who had returned that morning to review Brindle's scans, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. He was not one for speculation, but even his clinical detachment had been rattled. "Canine behavior doesn't lie easily," he admitted. "If his hostility is that specific, it warrants attention." "Combine that with the toxicology report," Gideon said, leaning against the counter, brown eyes dark with worry. "We'll increase security around him. No one handles Brindle without my permission. No food, no water, unless I or Daisy Pike supervise." "Understood." Everyone nodded, the gravity of his tone eliminating any doubt. Outside, Montana's sky darkened, early clouds pressing low over the pines as dusk painted the sanctuary in muted blue. Colt remained near Brindle's pen, humming softly, while the others dispersed. The shepherd, though drained from his growl, pressed his head against the glass, as if seeking Colt's presence. Colt reached out, calloused hand resting on the cool surface, whispering, "We'll find out who did this. I promise, Marine." For the first time in weeks, Brindle's tail thumped once against the straw, weak but deliberate, a soldier's answer. Dawn broke cold and gray over Redwood Ridge, the kind of Montana morning where mist clung stubbornly to treetops, and the mountains looked half asleep. The sanctuary stirred quietly, birds calling from the pine staff, unlocking storage sheds, the faint hum of generators filling the air. But inside the infirmary, tension gripped tighter than frost. Doc Gideon Holloway had spent a restless night circling one name, Jed Raleigh. Colt Remington wheeled himself into the staff lounge, where Gideon waited a thermos of black coffee untouched before him. He looked tired, jaw set with determination. His marine instincts, always evaluating suspicious of what didn't add up, had not dulled since Afghanistan. His body bore the cost legs unresponsive, yet his mind remained razor-sharp. "You really think it's him?" he asked, calm voice, betraying a flicker of unease. Gideon, still in scrubs, dark hair tied in a loose knot, rubbed his temple. Brindle's reaction wasn't random, Colt. Combine that with the lab results and Jed's behavior, something's off. I can't ignore it. The voice of a woman who had built her life-saving animals, not suspecting her own staff of betrayal. Daisy Pike entered carrying a clipboard, tall frame, straight and severe. She had spent the early morning tending to younger rescues, gentle hands, soothing a limping foal, but now her eyes carried a steel edge. Life had taken much her husband lost to illness, children grown and distant. Yet she had devoted herself to the animals here. Betrayal within those fences cut deeper than most. "I checked the feed logs," she said, voice clipped. "Jed signed in during off hours twice this week. Claims he was topping a pay, but those enclosures don't need it then." Colt's gray-blue eyes narrowed. "That's when you dose an animal when nobody's watching." His hands rested on the wheels, steady, prepared. "We need to confirm." Later that afternoon, Gideon pretended to assign Jed routine tasks, giving him the key to the staff supply room. Colt waited nearby, chair angled in the hallway shadows, while Daisy pretended to be occupied with medical charts. Rufus Lane, wiry and quiet, loitered near the maintenance shed with tools, eyes tracking the infirmary door. Jed moved through the corridors with the brisk stride of a man trying to look busy. Sandy hair fell across his forehead, mouth set too straight to be natural. He opened the supply room, glanced over his shoulder, then slipped inside. Minutes later, Gideon signaled Colt, heart pounding. Colt wheeled forward silently, a soldier once again on reconnaissance. Daisy followed heels, clicking softly. Inside the room smelled of bleach and feed grain, shelves lined with antiseptic syringes, and bags of kibble stretching toward the back wall. Jed knelt at a cabinet body half hidden. But Colt's trained eyes caught the motion. A small glass vial slipped from the shadows of Jed's hand. Doc Gideon Holloway stepped in. "Jed." His voice was firm, a command, rather than a greeting. Jed jerked upright, the vial nearly slipping from his fingers. His blue eyes widened, then narrowed into suspicion. "Doc Gideon Holloway." "I was just inventory," Jed Raleigh muttered. Daisy Pike's gaze burned into him. "Then why the false paperwork?" She lifted a folder from the records documents signed Jed Raleigh, but riddled with inconsistencies, dates, and mismatched signatures. Colt Remington rolled closer, voice even, but dangerous. "What's in the vial?" "Jed." The young man's mask, cracked lips curling into a sneer. For a moment, the polite assistant vanished. "You wouldn't understand," he spat, voice low and venomous. "This sanctuary sits on land worth millions. Redwood Ridge could be more than a collection of broken animals. Resorts, golf courses, luxury cabins. People would pay anything for these views." His words echoed rehearsed corporate greed, as if reciting a pitch memorized long ago. Gideon's stomach twisted. You tried to kill Brindle because his survival protects this land. Jed's jaw tightened. He's just one dog a symbol. Remove him and the land is free. His voice cracked with bitterness. And I was promised more than a lifetime of cleaning cages. At that exact moment, Brindle barked from the infirmary, hoarse but powerful, echoing down the hall like a gavel striking wood. The German Shepherd, frail yet defiant, had sensed the danger. His body strained against weakness, forcing himself upright, amber eyes fierce. His bark turned into a growl, then another bark, louder, declaring judgment. The sound shattered Jed's composure. He lunged for the door, but Colt Remington intercepted with surprising speed. His wheelchair angled to block the exit. Shoulders squared, voice calm but commanding. Stand down, son. It's over. Jed froze, chest-heaving vial glinting in his hand. For a second, his eyes darted toward the window, seeking escape. But Daisy Pike had already moved tall frame, blocking the other path clipboard. Gripped like a weapon, Doc Gideon Holloway, heart racing, pulled out his phone and called the sheriff's office. Within minutes, the sanctuary filled with flashing lights. Sheriff Silas Thorne, broad-shouldered, weathered features, gravelly voice, strode in, flanked by deputies. Known for unflinching honesty, Thorne had grown up in these mountains and carried himself like one of them, solid, immovable. He took one look at the vial, the falsified papers, and Jed's pale face, shaking his head. You picked the wrong town for this kind of treachery. The deputies cuffed Jed, reading his rights, while Brindle's barks echoed down the corridor. For the first time, the shepherd's voice was strong, like a drumbeat of justice. Volunteers and staff gathered, whispers spreading like wildfire. The sanctuary, once bruised by suspicion, now breathed in unison. Gideon leaned against the infirmary wall, relief flooding through him, though hands still trembled. Colt wheeled beside him, expression solemn but proud. Brindle knew, he said quietly, eyes on the dog, now collapsed back onto his bedding, spent but unbroken. Even when the rest of us were guessing, he never doubted. Gideon looked at Brindle, tears welling. He's our proof, Colt, not just for the poisoning, but for why we fight to keep this place alive. Brindle's tail thumped weakly once against the straw body, trembling from exhaustion, yet his spirit roared louder than ever. The days following Jed's arrest unfolded with fragile relief at Redwood Ridge. Shadows lingered, but the storm had passed. Brindle survived, though his body bore the weight of weeks of poison. Outside, Montana's skies alternated between pale winter sun and sudden gusts sweeping down from the ridges, rattling the infirmary windows. Doc Gideon Holloway worked tirelessly, hair often escaping the knot at her neck as she monitored Brindle's vitals. She began treatment with Prussian blue, the rare antidote that binds thallium in the bloodstream, carrying it out safely. The capsules were dark, administered carefully with food substitutes. Brindle swallowed reluctantly, eyes clouded with exhaustion, yet hinting at a faint light of hope. Gideon's hazel eyes softened whenever she saw his ears twitch at a familiar voice, a proof that life still sparked within. Colt Remington remained a constant presence. The 37-year-old former Marine wheeled himself into the infirmary every morning, strong shoulders pushing the chair with quiet resolve. Confined since Afghanistan, he carried the same discipline and steadiness that once defined his unit. He sat by Brindle's side, gravelly voice, filling the sterile room with camaraderie stories of desert heat, long patrols, songs, sung to keep fear at bay. Sometimes his voice cracked, yet Brindle's ears lifted, reminding him he was not alone. One evening, twilight painted the sanctuary purple and gold. Colt began humming the Marine's song, low and steady voice rising with conviction. Brindle stirred, chest-heaving, amber eyes cracking open. Brindle's tail gave a faint thump against the bedding. Doc Gideon Holloway, clipboard in hand, blinked back sudden tears. "He's responding," she whispered, scribbling quickly. "Colt Remington, don't stop." It became a ritual. Each day, Colt returned with new stories or half-remembered songs, and each time Brindle answered with small victories, a lifted head, a wagging tail, or a faint bark. These were not the signs of a dying dog, but of one clawing his way back. The sanctuary was alive with observers. Volunteers moved in and out, carrying food and checking enclosures, but one young woman lingered more often near Brindle's ward. Her name was Clara May Boone, a college sophomore volunteering during winter break. Slight, with long red hair, usually braided, and freckles across her nose, she was shy but attentive. The kind of girl who would spend hours quietly sketching animals in the corner rather than drawing attention to herself. She had lost her father, also a veteran, 2 years earlier, and though she rarely spoke of it, her grief had made her fiercely protective of every animal in the sanctuary. One afternoon, while Colt told Brindle a story about his first deployment, Clara May quietly lifted her phone, capturing the moment when Brindle's ears perked, head tilting toward Colt's words like a soldier recognizing an old command. The dog's ribs still showed beneath his patchy coat, breathing shallow, yet the connection between man and animal was undeniable. Clara May hesitated before posting the clip online, adding a simple caption, "A Marine and a German Shepherd fight to survive together." She thought little of it at first, but by the next morning her phone buzzed incessantly. The video had spread like wildfire, shared thousands of times, comments overflowing with prayers, donations, and words of solidarity. By week's end, major news outlets had picked it up. Headlines blared. "Wounded soldier inspires dying dog to live again." Donations poured into Redwood Ridge's account, from $5 to thousands. Messages came from veterans groups, animal lovers, and even classrooms of children sending drawings of Brindle standing strong beside Colt in his wheelchair. Sheriff Silas Thorne, who had overseen Jed Raleigh's arrest, stopped by to check in. Broad-shouldered, weathered face breaking into a rare smile, he shook Colt's hand. "Looks like you two started something bigger than this town. People believe in him." In you, his voice carried decades of law enforcement authority, a man hardened by crime, yet softened by glimpses of humanity's best. Doc Gideon Holloway could hardly keep up with the flood of support. Packages arrived daily, blankets, toys, care kits. Letters addressed to Brindle the Brave. She posted updates on the sanctuary website, her scientific voice giving way to heartfelt gratitude. For the first time in months, Redwood Ridge's financial struggles began to ease, but nothing mattered more than the change inside Brindle's enclosure. Each day, his breath grew steadier, appetite slowly returning. His fur, though still uneven, now glimmered faintly under the infirmary lights. One morning, Colt rolled in with his thermos of coffee and worn notebook of stories. Brindle barked weakly, but loud enough to make Doc Gideon Holloway drop her pen in surprise. Colt grinned, eyes misty. "That's the sound of a fighter, Doc. That's a Marine's answer." Even Clara May, usually quiet in the background, smiled through tears as she filmed the moment, knowing the world outside would want to witness this victory too. By the end of the week, Brindle managed to rise shakily onto all fours for the first time since his collapse. Legs trembling, chest heaving, he stood. Colt wheeled closer, voice low and encouraging. "Attaboy, one step at a time." Brindle's gaze locked on Colt, and with monumental effort he took a halting step before collapsing back down. The room erupted in quiet cheers. Doc Gideon Holloway, Daisy Pike, Clara May Boone, and even Rufus Lane, who had slipped in silently to watch. Brindle had not yet won the war against the poison, but something stronger than medicine pulsed through him, now hope carried by the voice of a Marine who refused to leave a comrade behind. The morning of the event dawned brighter than anyone at Redwood Ridge had dared hope. Montana's late winter skies were often gray and heavy, but that day sunlight streamed over the ridges, spilling across the sanctuary like a blessing. The crisp air smelled faintly of pine and thawing earth, the kind of morning that carried promise. For weeks, Brindle had been recovering under Doc Gideon Holloway's careful eye and Colt Remington's steady companionship. The antidote had done its work. Ribs no longer protruded, and the once patchy coat now shone with a healthy gloss. His steps, though measured, carried strength again. Doc Gideon Holloway had barely slept the night before, hazel eyes betraying both fatigue and pride. She wore her clean white coat for the ceremony, dark hair tied neatly to keep it from her face. For her, the event was more than a celebration. It was a declaration that cruelty had failed and compassion had prevailed. Daisy Pike moved briskly among volunteers, tall, willowy frame, commanding quiet respect. Today she wore a green scarf draped across her shoulders, the color bright against her pale skin. Years of hardship had taught her to be practical, but as Daisy Pike arranged fresh blooms on the podium, her tough demeanor softened. For Daisy, Brindle's survival wasn't just in spurring, it echoed her own path. Grief met with grit. Rufus Lane, lean and focused, tested the sound gear with quiet precision. He wasn't one for chatter, but something about his steady presence calmed the younger volunteers. A few feet away, Amos Thatcher, broad-chested with a coach's bark, ushered guests into their seats, like he ran Friday night football. Colt Remington wheeled himself toward the center lawn, clad in a crisp shirt and worn blazer, his calloused hands gliding over the rims of his chair with the ease of repetition. His face bore the strain of years, but those stormy gray eyes locked onto Brindle, and in them there was gentleness. The deserts of Afghanistan had once convinced Colt his service was done. Brindle reminded him it had just taken a different form. Rows of folding chairs lined the open grass near the sanctuary meadow. Locals, donors, families, and journalists packed the space. Kids clutched hand-painted signs that read, "Go Brindle" and "Thank you, Heroes." A low buzz filled the air as cameras clicked into place and mics got final adjustments. Sheriff Silas Thorne, built like a brick wall, stood up front, his sharp-creased uniform catching the light. His sun-worn face was softer today, pride flickering behind his usual stoicism. He'd stood watch over this town through dark days, but this was different. This was a win. Then Doc Gideon Holloway stepped up to the podium. The crowd quieted. Her voice was calm, but something warm stirred beneath it. 3 weeks ago, Brindle was on death's doorstep, poisoned, betrayed, nearly broken. But with care from this sanctuary, the fierce devotion of our volunteers, and the bond between him and Colt Remington today, Brindle stands tall as living proof that hope can outlast cruelty. A wave of applause broke across the field. Reporters clicked away as Doc Holloway went on, "It's my honor to announce the creation of the Brindle Fund, dedicated to protecting abused animals and expanding our conservation work. Because of you, Redwood Ridge won't just survive, it'll thrive." Behind her, a banner dropped, of the Brindle Fund, protecting life, protecting land. At her signal, Daisy and Rufus stepped forward with Brindle. Gasps rippled. The shepherd walked tall sunlight glinting off his glossy black and tan coat. His amber gaze was alive again, alert, aware, scanning the crowd like he'd done it 1,000 times before. He paced beside Daisy, sure-footed, commanding. But then something shifted. Brindle spotted Colt. His ears perked. Tail flicked once. And just like that, he surged forward. Daisy barely had time to let go as Brindle broke from her side and trotted across the platform straight to the man in the wheelchair. Colt's jaw clenched, emotion building in his throat. "Come on, Marine," he murmured, voice rough with tears. Brindle didn't hesitate. He reached Colt, pressed his head hard against his legs, and held there like a soldier reporting back to his commander. The world froze. Cameras snapped like thunder, but the crowd held their breath, reverent in the face of something raw and real. Then the cheers came erupting into the sky. A young reporter blinked back tears. To her cameraman, she whispered, "That picture, that's the story." And she was right. By nightfall, the image of Brindle leaning into Colt's lap would be everywhere, an emblem of survival loyalty and the bonds some tried to destroy but couldn't. Doc Holloway, hand pressed to her chest, blinked away emotion. Daisy swiped at a tear, all stoicism gone. Rufus cracked a rare smile. And Amos Ever, the booming coach, hollered, "That's our boy!" Children waved their signs even higher. Sheriff Thorne gave a firm nod, jaw-tight eyes shining. As the ceremony wrapped, sanctuary staff gathered behind the stage. Donors offered handshakes. Children lined up with crayon-drawn cards. Reporters hunted quotes. But none of it mattered more than Brindle still nestled at Colt's feet, amber eyes glowing like he knew this moment would never come again. For Colt, it was more than a public tribute. He'd fought battles across oceans, survived wounds that left him broken-haunted. But now, with Brindle's warm weight leaning into him, he felt something he hadn't known in years, peace. And maybe, just maybe, a new mission. The Montana sky stretched wide and endless above them. Blue, bold, unbroken. Just like the hope growing in the heart of Redwood Ridge. The days after the Brindle Fund ceremony brought new energy to the land, not just healing, but rebirth. Volunteers filled the fields. Laughter echoed from the barns, and Brindle, once a ghost of a dog, now walked through the light as if he was made from it. Brindle's gait had returned strong and sure. His coat shone with a thick, healthy gloss, and his amber eyes burned with the quiet fire of survival. But as Doc Gideon Holloway knew all too well, healing a body was only the beginning. Giving that survival a purpose. That was the real work. To do that, she brought in Daniel Whitmore, a seasoned dog behaviorist from Spokane. In his early 50s, Daniel was tall, slightly hunched from decades spent crouching beside animals. His flannel shirts were always rumpled, his beard peppered with gray, and around his neck hung a well-worn whistle. But what truly set him apart was his gaze, steady, kind, and deliberate. The sort of man who looked at every dog like it had a story worth listening to. He carried grief in his bones. Years ago, he'd lost his son, a veteran haunted by war, taken too soon by the shadows PTSD left behind. That loss turned Daniel's life toward helping others heal training therapy dogs for soldiers who'd come home, but never really returned. His first sessions with Brindle were gentle, careful. He tested the shepherd's reactions to sudden sounds, to touch, to chaos. Brindle startled when Daniel clapped hard, but the moment Colt Remington's voice rang out, the dog calmed instantly. Brindle tensed at the sight of medical equipment, yet when Doc Holloway approached with a stethoscope, he didn't move. His trust held. Daniel nodded quietly. "This isn't just a survivor," he said. "This is a partner he's just waiting for someone to ask him." Colt hesitated. His upper body was still strong, but life in a wheelchair had left him wary of hope, of the weight of responsibility. He'd seen how quickly everything could be taken. But then, in a quiet session one afternoon, Brindle walked up and rested his massive head across Colt's lap. Their eyes met amber to stormy gray-blue, and in that silence, Colt heard something old and familiar stir inside him. Stand up, soldier, in the ways that still matter. Weeks passed. Slowly, Brindle began joining small therapy demonstrations. At first, it was just a few local veterans brought in by Sheriff Silas Thorne, men and women who bore invisible wounds as much as visible ones. One of them, Frank Holloway, a Vietnam vet in his 60s, leaned heavy on a cane and walked with a limp earned half a world away. His weathered face cracked with disbelief when Brindle pressed his body close, steady, and still. Frank's hand trembled as it fell onto Brindle's fur. "This dog," he whispered, voice thick. "He doesn't just look at you. He sees you." Soon, the therapy circle widened. Daisy Pike helped organize visits with a nearby special education class. One bright morning, children in wheelchairs and braces gathered in the sanctuary's meadow. Their giggles faded to awe when Brindle approached. One boy with cerebral palsy stretched out a shaking hand, and without hesitation, Brindle dropped gently to the ground, lowering his body so the boy could touch him. Daisy, usually composed and tall in her boots, turned away just long enough to wipe her tears. Her husband had been taken by illness years ago. She knew too well the ache of watching someone fight for joy again. Nearby, Clara Mae Boone, once the shy girl with a sketch pad, now carried a camera like it was part of her. Her red braids swung with every step as she followed Brindle from the therapy fields to the barns, capturing each quiet moment of connection. The viral video she'd filmed months ago had started something, but now it had transformed her. She told Doc Holloway she planned to study journalism, because stories like Brindle's Clara said they need to be told. And Colt, his life shifted too. He wasn't just a visitor anymore. Under Daniel's watchful eye, he became Brindle's handler. He learned to read the shepherd's signals, to guide him through sessions, to speak without words. Where once Colt had believed his injury marked the end of his service, Brindle had shown him another truth. "I thought I lost my unit overseas," Colt told Doc Holloway one night. Brindle lay at his side, head on his boots. "Turns out, I was just waiting for a new one. Their story grew too big to stay inside Redwood Ridge. Offers came in. Eventually, Doc Holloway agreed to work with Helen Grant, a quiet, perceptive writer in her early 40s, known for her heartfelt biographies. No relation to the disgraced Jed Raleigh, Helen carried herself with quiet purpose and a notebook always close. She shadowed Colt and Brindle for weeks, watched as Colt hummed lullabies while Brindle napped beside him, noted every time the dog rested his chin in the lap of a trembling veteran. She even caught a rare sound one dusk, Colt's laughter echoing across the meadow. A year later, the book Brindle, a story of survival and service, hit the shelves. The cover showed the now famous photo from the Brindle Fund ceremony, Brindle pressing against Colt's legs, both of them looking toward the light. The book soared. Schools adopted it as a lesson in resilience. Families passed it down. Then came the documentary created by a passionate indie film crew. They captured it all: Brindle at work, kids hugging him, Colt rolling through sanctuary paths at dusk with his companion pacing at his side. Redwood Ridge transformed. Once a quiet, crumbling place on the edge of shutting down, it now thrived. Donations poured in. Visitors came from across the country. Laughter rang through the meadows again. Animals once discarded now walked with heads high. And through it all, Doc Holloway would walk the grounds at dusk, smiling as she watched how one dog had changed everything. At the premiere of the documentary, when asked what Brindle meant to him, Colt leaned forward toward the mic. "People say I saved him," he said, voice steady. "But that's not true. He didn't just survive because of me. I survived because of him. He gave me purpose again. Reminded me that life doesn't end when you're wounded. Sometimes that's when it really begins." The audience stood clapping, but Colt wasn't watching them. His eyes were locked on Brindle, who stood at his side, ears alert, amber eyes glowing. For Brindle, no words were needed. Brindle leaned in once more, resting his massive head gently against Colt Remington's leg. The very same gesture he had made weeks ago on that stage. It wasn't just a dog seeking comfort, it was a Marine's answer, a friend's vow. Sometimes miracles don't come with trumpets or lightning. Sometimes they arrive in the quiet bond between a broken soldier and a discarded dog, two souls refusing to let go. Brindle's recovery wasn't just science. It was something deeper, something sacred. It was grace. It was the quiet hand of God whispering that no soul is ever too lost, no wound too deep for redemption. In everyday life, we may never face a war zone or the poison of betrayal, but we do face sorrow, isolation, and fear. And like Colt and Brindle, we are called to rise, to hold on to one another, and to believe again. To love again. If you believe God still moves through second chances, through animals, through people, through loyalty that never lets go, then share this story. Leave a comment. Type Amen. If this miracle touched your heart like it did ours, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Together we'll keep telling stories that restore hope, that remind the world that yes, God is still at work right here among us. May the Lord bless you and protect you. May He fill you with courage for every trial, and may His light shine over your life just as it once saved Brindle.